get them again. So thank you very much for joining us. And today, as I said, we'll be going through developing how to develop your story and build an effective pitch toolkit. There's going to be plenty of time for questions, so I'll stop a couple of times through the webinar. If people want to ask anything, don't hesitate to just put questions into the toolbox, which you can see hopefully on your dashboard. And if you just pop in any comments and thoughts or questions, then I'll get to them as we go through. And if you've got, if you want to feel like tweeting at any stage, go for your life with that. Either you can tweet us at 50acres, FIFTYACRES, or my handle is Scarred Joe. So feel free to do that if you'd like to. Although I probably won't be responding to you because I'm talking. I can't walk and chew gum clearly. So today, we're doing two things. We're going to look at developing your story and how to build your pitch toolkit. And some of this stuff's pretty basic, and I suppose it's going to recap stuff that some of you may know already. So my apologies if I am teaching you how to suck eggs better than you already know how to. But it is, I think, quite useful sometimes to go back to the basics and think about how you're doing things, because, we all have to pitch our stories to journalists, and some of us love it. Some of us don't love it. Some of us would rather be, cutting our fingernails or toenails, but, other people, have no problem with it at all. So I think it is a good idea to start by going back to the basics and thinking about how you do it. And the practicalities, I think, of organising yourself to do a pitch. So let's get started. To a lot of people hate the word pitching. When you say that you're spending a day on the phone pitching to journalists, most people need a lot of cups of tea to get through that. And it's a very self-serving, demanding. It's a demanding thing to do. But you do have to really put your heart and soul in it to actually get any dividends. And, this is what we're going to go through today. It's important that you're not just selling. It's important that you're communicating to them. And, it's the wrong approach, I think, if you're just going to pitch up to them. You need to be able to build a relationship and be human. And I've always said that to people. I've always thought that whether it's engaging with media or with politicians or with corporate stakeholders, it's about establishing a rapport, and we'll think about how some of the ways that you can do that as well. So, in order to establish that credibility and to be a human being, you really do have to allow them to come to the realization that you've got something to offer. You're not just trying to sell them something. So, how is the best way to approach that? So let's now talk about developing a story. I think it's important to think like a journalist. There is a number of different ways that you can do that. You've got different people will have different things to sell. Some of you will be pitching up or trying to suggest a story about an issue. Something, a campaign that you're waging. It would be something. It might be an event. It could be a fundraising initiative. There's all sorts of things that you might be trying to get coverage for. So, how do you do that? And there's obviously no hard and fast rules about how you do that. But, before you pitch, I think you need to really take a long, hard look at your organisation. And think about what's really interesting, what's really remarkable about what you're doing. I mean, I often have people who come to us and say, and like anything, I think if you have a media release or a pitch, you really are incredibly optimistic about it, and you always think you're going to get coverage, or you always hope that you're going to get coverage. You've really got to be very honest with yourself and think, what part of this story is truly interesting? What's really remarkable about this? What is it that's going to grab people's attention? And that's got to be the foundation to move forward. It's not just going to be the fact that you're a group of people doing some good work. That's not enough. There is lots of people doing good work. You need to find something that is remarkable that's going to stand out. So, the story that you share with the world is about where you've come from, what you stand for, what's the passion, what's the thing that's driving you, what's the vision that you've got, how is it going to highlight the struggles, the highs and the lows, the victories, the human side of what you're doing. Think about that before you even pick up the phone. I think it's important to have those things sketched out and scoped out. So there's no point in sending, irrelevant information to journalists. It's much more effective to take a very strategic approach. There's, and I'm sure you've been there where you've had people suggesting that they want to write a 3-page media release. You've got to have 3 or 4 people quoted in it. You've got to have attachments and, all sorts of things. And we all know the truth that most people don't grab all that information. You've really got to be very strategic and simple about what you're going to send to them. Most of the time, journalists are going to be not necessarily even opening an attachment. So that's something we'll talk about in a second. But, you need to grab something. You need to create something that they're going to be interested in, and that's going to be your story. And whatever that story is, you need to establish that before you pick up the phone. So make sure that you tell them a story or talk to them about a story. Don't just read them a press release. So, if you are picking up the phone or you're sending out a release, you may be communicating to people via an email. We'll get to that in a second, but, it may be an email, and then you follow that up with a phone call, or it might be, a media release that you then follow up or that you send out with a personal email to cover it off. But obviously, I always think that just a media release isn't necessarily going to get you there. And it isn't. So many media releases are, I think people either really, they think they're writing a story. I think the journalists are the ones that do that by and large. Sometimes a journalist will ask for more information and more copy, and you can always give them that. Very often, I'm sure you've all been in the situation where you've had a local journalist or even someone in a metropolitan, or an online site who's wanted much more text from you, and you can give them that. But I think giving them the basics is really what they're after. And then they're probably going to want to spin that and, take that into the direction they want. But I think just giving them a media release shouldn't ever be the first thing that you send to a journalist. From our point of view, what we normally do with people is we'll send them a pitch, an email. Hi, how you going? Making it sound slightly human, like you're a human being and you're talking to them as a human. And, we've got this is happening. Let me know if you're interested. We'll give you a call and have a chat about it, And it's no big deal. We're not giving them, there's not 16 paragraphs of information that they can never get to. It's really just the essence of what it is you're trying to tell them in a sentence or two. And we often find, and I often would certainly recommend to a client, that that's a much better approach than just sending out media releases endlessly, because I think people are, my husband works at the Sydney Morning Herald, he's a photographer, and I think the last time I looked at his inbox, he had 832 unopened emails. These are from people who are sending him things to try and get him along to take a photograph of the event for the Sydney Morning Herald or The Age. So, there's lots and lots of stuff coming into people's inboxes. You've got to make sure that you cut through that. And, it may take you, a couple of goes at that and a couple of calls, but just sending a media release with a screaming capitals headline. I know a lot of journalists now who are quite offended if they get a headline that is a subject line that's in capitals. and they immediately delete it. Different people have different proclivities, and I think you need to sort of try and understand what those are. Um, but notwithstanding any of that, it has to have a narrative. It has to, even if that's just a sentence. What's the story? Tell them it. They don't need to have it in chapter and verse. They don't need a lot of detail. They just need the essence of it. Something that's going to really get them interested. So how are you going to be read? Well, there's a much higher chance of that email getting read if it's something that they're going to be likely to cover. So there's no point in sending, a finance journalist something about, something that they're not going to ever do, or social affairs writer something about something that they're never going to do. You've got to pitch the story to the right person. And yes, the news desks take a lot of this stuff in, but that's exactly right. They do take a lot of that stuff in. So you need to make sure that you're not just sending it to the news desk, because the chances statistically of them grabbing hold of it is even going to be less than if you send it to one of the specialists. And the follow through is absolutely important for anyone, whether that's the news desk, who you might get a very brittle and very quick, sharp reply, through to someone who's a correspondent, who or either that's in print or online, or whether that's radio or TV. They're all really in the same boat in many respects. So essentially, what are journalists like? They want to have a compelling story, and that's fundamentally what they do. Whether they're a radio journalist, whether they're a TV journalist, whether they're newsprint or online, they all want a story. Now, sometimes we're not dealing today about how you move them from talking about the negative to the positive. You're trying to obviously sell or persuade them to do something that's by and large positive about your organisation. So essentially, they want something that's going to compel their readers, that people are going to click on, they're going to read. And so as a consequence to that, your story needs to be really good. They need to get something that's going to get them and grab them and go, I'm interested in this. I think there will be people who will also be interested in it. They get thousands of media releases every day, and stories and emails and calls. So you need to be able to stand out amongst all of that. And that's very easy to say, but how do you actually do it? So, what do they want? They want, a good human interest story. They want, a story of hope, and you've got a lot of those, I'm sure. You've got one that talks about, someone's emotional journey, or an unlikely underdog that's triumphed. All of these stories can be interesting and engaging. They want to know about, the problems that the organisation might be solving, which is what you're all doing, and what motivates the team to come to work every day. What sort of stuff are you doing? What are you doing? What's the adversity that you're facing to do what you're doing? To actually achieve what you're getting done. So, have a think about all of that before you even start doing anything. You need to sit down, and maybe that's a brainstorm with the person on the next desk. Maybe that's just a group meeting, just to think about what the media is for the month. But it's maybe it's you're talking amongst yourselves in your own time, in your own head. But it's about that planning time and really having a think about that before you jump in without any plans. So the next thing is you obviously got to take it out of your head, take it off the whiteboard, and put it somewhere so that you can then communicate it to people. Because no longer are we just ringing a journalist and telling them a story. Yes, people do that, but in this world, we need to be able to email them something as well as calling them. So the challenge is always finding a way to differentiate your organisation from everyone else. You need to identify the story and craft it into words that can be a really challenging part of this process. It's not easy to you can think that you've got the most extraordinary story in the world, but actually putting it down in writing and simplifying it, I think, is the really key thing. how do you simplify a story that can be really complicated? That's often a battle for people, and I think it's about trying to distill it into as simplest possible story as you possibly can, and that's probably aiming at a 12-year-old or a 11-year-old audience. If you can communicate it to a year 7 or a year 6 kid, then I reckon you're probably there. You need to be able to talk about your story pretty simply, because that's by and large how most media write. It's not necessarily their intellectual abilities, but it's about how they write for most audiences, unless you're from a specialist publication with a specialist audience, so something like the Fin Review or a specialist journal, then you've obviously perhaps using other language, but most mainstream media are not writing complex prose. So I think you need to reflect that in the material that you write for them. I think that's really very, very important. So how do you get started? What do you write down? What is there? What's part of that story? What's part of the narrative? Well, what inspired you to establish the organisation in the first place? What's driving you? What is it that underpins what it is that you're doing on this particular occasion, whether that's an event, a fundraising drive, or an initiative about changing policy, and something about lobbying someone about something. Whatever it is, there must be some sort of ultimate destination. So where is it going, and why is it important? How will you tell people about that? I think they're all really good things to be factoring into what you're going to say. In the context of it, what have you achieved? You don't have to throw all this in all the time, but in the context of what you're saying, a throwaway line about what the organisation's achieved or hopes to achieve or has done and is doing. And again, that brings up a question about, how do you explain this stuff? And a lot of organisations are now moving to metrics and analysis of their work, which takes them beyond just the amount of human beings that they're sort of touching and helping. It's more than just the touch point, the human touch points. It's not that we helped 362 people last year. It's about, what did we achieve when we did that? How did we help move, people out of poverty? We helped 623 people find housing, but what economic impact, what human impact, what social impact does that have? And you don't necessarily put that all in a media release, but these are all really interesting things that journalists are now, expecting almost to see, that sort of social analysis work that underpins what you're doing. It's no longer just enough to say, we're good people and we do good stuff. You've actually got to explain what you're achieving, and it's not just about the numbers. It's about what you're actually doing. And, I've worked with clients who've had all sorts of metrics that they've established, and they're not necessarily going to be all in your media release. But if you can permeate some of the work that you are doing, some of the narrative that you're using with some of that sort of information that's substantial, then you'll get the Fin Reviews, you'll get the women's agendas, you'll get the conversations or the substantial coverage, because you're saying something that's actually quite pivotal. And I think that's very important. So, don't be hesitant to talk about your successes. Sometimes people are uncomfortable about that. Sometimes you're obviously, some of you are writing and working with people who are, some of you are CEOs, or some of you are working with assisting and supporting CEOs or executives or boards. Sometimes boards and executives and CEOs are reluctant to sing their own praises. That makes a lot of sense. A lot of people are like that. But quite frankly, the media likes people who've succeeded. They like a positive story, and you need to give them that. So don't be hesitant to talk through some of those success stories. I think that's particularly important. So, you need to turn the story into a pitch. but it needs to be a journalist-friendly one. So how do you do that? So, the pitch is often, just a short list of bullet points. It can be a media release, but you need a vehicle. Obviously, you can't just be, it needs to be presented fairly coherently, pretty neatly. Think about when you receive emails, and if you receive an email that looks pretty messy with spelling mistakes in it, perhaps in different fonts or different colors, or people haven't really cared about what they're doing, you're less likely to be influenced by it perhaps than a neatly presented, quite clearly expressed email that clearly presents what it wants to achieve. So have a think about what it looks like before you send, and test it out before you. If you're sending a lot of people, test it to someone in the office. And you need to bear in mind that when you cut and paste emails from your inbox, sometimes the formatting goes awry, and so you need to make sure that you've tweaked all of that before you send those emails out. Otherwise, people will get emails that look a bit strange. You can create a release. You need to keep it media friendly. I always think that it's always good to have that in the back pocket, because quite often you'll send a pitch out to someone, and we often do this. We'll often send out a pitch as the first activity that we do for a story. And then someone will say, do you have more information? And if you've got that media release ready to go, then you can send it. I often think that's a much better approach. Building rapport. Journalists aren't wedded to a particular organisation or an agenda. You need to build a rapport with them first. You can't make an assumption that they're going to behave or think in a certain way. You need to talk to them like they're human beings, effectively, I think is a really important thing. Fundamentally, you probably heard the rule of what do you need to say to a journalist? Well, you need to include the who, what, where, when, why, but also your value proposition, because fundamentally they're the sort of facts that people are wanting to know about. Who's going to say it? What are they saying? If it's an event, where is it? When is it? And why is it happening? But what's the value proposition behind all that? And you might be able to say that in the context of the why, but, that's when you get into some of that depth, some of that inherent value in what you're doing as an organisation, where you're making a difference, not just in the amount of people you're servicing or helping, but in the real drivers that you're changing, how you're really, really driving some social change or influence or whatever it is that you're doing. Break the rules. Think about how you might do it differently, how you're going to make it interesting. Perhaps you're doing it in perhaps it's a video release, or it's a video message. Perhaps it's if you've got the resources, you use graphics. These are obviously time consuming and perhaps have budgets associated with them. But, if it's a very important part of an event or a campaign, then have a think about how you might do it. The other way you can do it is if it's a really important campaign that you're launching, and it's a national campaign and you've got some resources, think about how you might mail something to someone. What could you mail to them which is an unusual item that triggers them to think about what it is you're saying. A pitch does not have to be, an email. It could be, something that they get, which is an item which they'll keep. It can be in the form of guerrilla marketing, or different forms of communication. It doesn't just have to be the normal options that you always fall back on, but that takes creativity. It takes some planning. You need to have some collateral. You need to have some money to get that collateral made, and then you need to get it out to people. But in some instances with major national campaigns, you do have those budgets and you do have that time, and it is important to have a think about those options. So I always think about having 3 often is a good number, key points that you want to say to someone. 1's not really enough. We're doing this because it's good. That doesn't really get you there. We're doing this and, it's on now. Well, yep. But you could say, we're doing this. It's happening here, and this is the reason. And with those 3 points, you really sort of can get all of those bits, those key elements into a very short pitch. So you can get the who, the what, the where, the when, the why, and your value proposition probably in 3 points, I would think. That's not 3 lengthy paragraphs. It's 3 key points, really. And I think for a pitch, that's probably all you need. And if you think about that, and if you've got, sitting back and writing a media release, I always, it's very rare that we would ever put out a media release if we ever do put out a media release. And some clients really want a media release and you can't dissuade them of it. The board expects it and they have to put this out for some reason or whatever. There might be some sort of requirement. I will always try to talk people out of doing something that's anything longer than a page, because I just don't think there's any value in it. Yes, sometimes you need something that's longer, but, I think if you can't say it in a page, you're not the one that's writing the story. You're giving them some information that goes into a story. You can always give them some supplementary information if they really need it. But I think those key bits really are in a page, or, more often than not, we won't attach a media release to an email because, how many people are getting how much stuff in their inboxes. We all know how much we get in our inboxes and how much we delete. Journalists are no different. They're probably even, they're worse than we are. So, having an attachment is just one other impediment to getting your media release read. So I often will put it into the body of an email, because I just think it's more likely to be read if it's just sitting there and they can see it and they just scroll down, and then therefore it's shorter and much more easier to manage. I've got a question from Lisa. She asks, do you recommend sending thank you emails to journos as good etiquette? Yes, look, I do. I mean, I've been a journalist myself. I'm married to one. I've worked in TV, print, and radio. Depending on what you're doing, I actually, if it's it's a positive story and you've got some nice coverage, then absolutely, I think just saying thanks so much for your coverage of the X, Y, or Z. It was, really valuable, and look forward to having a chat with you or catching up with you in a few weeks' time to let you know about X or Y. Almost use it as a segue to the next thing, so that you've sort of enticed them about something else you're doing, and they are prepared that they may hear from you again. So I think it is a good etiquette. If they've done something, you just got to sort of make sure that it's not crossing the line. And I wouldn't ever have an argument with a journalist on email. It's probably not a very productive thing for a relationship if you don't agree with what they've said or written about you. I'd always talk to them on the phone, unless it gets to a point where you need to take legal action. Obviously, that needs to be in writing, and that's probably something that's coming from your solicitors if you've engaged them. But that's a different matter. So I think a thank you email never goes astray, because journalists by and large aren't paid a lot of money, and I think it's well worth doing. They're like any human being. You do like being thanked for what you do. So let's think about how you start. You need to get a system in place. So you've got an event, you've got a promotion, you've got a campaign. Obviously if it's a campaign, you're probably thinking about it for some months, but whatever it is, you really need to at least start pitching at least 3 to 5 business days before the launch date, depending on the lead-in time of the publication or of the outlet. If it's the Women's Weekly that you're aiming for, you really need to talk to them 4 to 6 months beforehand, or it's a magazine. If it's the radio, they're much more tight turnarounds. But notwithstanding that, I mean, we've just pitched in something for a client, and they got a 45, almost an hour-long discussion on Radio National on a program, and we pitched that into them with a couple of weeks so that they had some time to get their head around it, get some other talent into the studio. Sometimes we pitch a lot to places like Life Matters. And if you're pitching something big that needs a lot of work, you obviously 4 to 5 days isn't enough for that. So you need to really think about when those outlets are going to need you to talk to them. So it might be some weeks in advance in some instances. But if it's just a normal, story, then 4 to 5 days a week is probably fine. So you need to have a plan. You need to think about what are the outlets that you desire most, what are the ones with the longest lead-in time, and work your way back from that. Work from the media list, and making sure that you don't pitch to them twice. Yes, you can ring them back for a follow-up, but a lot of journalists these days, you get more resentment, I think, than anything else if you call them 2 or 3 times. Unless it's something extraordinary that you really know that they will really want to know about, and you just haven't been able to catch them, and you've got a personal relationship with them, then by all means chase them. But I think sometimes chasing people incessantly down rabbit holes can be more unproductive. You need to be able to appear accommodating and friendly, but if you're too overly friendly and you let them know that you've seen the photos of their kids on Twitter or Facebook or whatever else, they'll probably just think you're a bit of a strange person that's just observing them a bit too closely. So you just need to have that, keen sense of being friendly but professional rather than friendly and a bit too close to them, because it is a professional relationship you are having with them, unless they're a friend of yours, of course, and then that's obviously something that's different. So don't treat no's like they're no necessarily. I mean, in life, I never really take no's from many people, particularly politicians, because we do a lot of lobbying, and if I did that, we'd never get anywhere. But we certainly, if you're talking to a journalist and they're just saying no, rather than hanging up, just saying, look, out of interest, why, you're just busy this week. It's not where you're up to, not where you're at. What about in this space? What is it that you're interested in? So it's not necessarily saying to them, what could we come back to you with, blah, blah, blah. It's more about having a general chat around the houses about what it is they're interested in at the moment, I think, is the key thing. So it's important, I think, to treat every no as an opportunity for a future yes. And when you can come back to them, they might give you a whole lot of answers there that are really helpful. So use that opportunity when you're talking to them to, get that leverage point, find out what they might be in the coming weeks and months. So securing media coverage, it needs to be, relevant timing, and then you can think about how you might, what I call, newsjacking. So, there's a good chance that your event or the story alone isn't going to be enough to entice journalists. That's why you have to present the launch or the story or, through an angle that the journalists will find interesting. We talked about that before. It's important to remember that journalists want timely and relevant news stories. If you give them something, how often have you seen it where, your board wants to tell them about something that they decided 3 days ago at a board meeting or whatever it is? You've got to be on the front foot because they're not going to be interested in talking about old news. So you've got to be able to factor all of those things in. And if you can craft something around the fact that it's going to be timely and relevant and it's going to work alongside something that they're going to be perhaps covering or looking at that's newsjacking, then you may have the potential for a really good story, and you'll get a run, which will be just great. So when drafting your pitch, what should you consider? Well, you need to make sure it's relevant. So you need to take time to research the journalist before you pitch to them. So you need to know that the story is something that they might want to cover. Timing. You need to have a look at the recent articles that they've done, either online or what else have they covered on the radio or whatever they've done on TV or wherever they've been, making sure that it's going to be, on point for them. Newsjacking. How can you harness the viral power of something else that's trending? How can you get on the back of that and take part in that discussion? And many of you are involved with stuff that's happening. what is it that's going on? Is it a current holiday, or is it the day of something, or is it a study, or is it whatever? Get that as a tie-in. There's a couple of questions up there, and I'll just come to them in a second. Humility. It's important, I think, to be humble, to be polite and decent, because fundamentally these guys are under the pump most of the time. There's less of them. They have long hours. It's pretty tough. And that'll help your message go down easier. If they say, no, sorry, not interested, it's not a personal affront to you. It's not them trying to be rude or, whatever. It's not a personal thing. You need to try and disassociate yourself from that personal, from those feelings, and go, okay, how can I work with this? What is it that I could do here? And newsworthy, does it shock, does it surprise, or does it spark feelings of interest? So, how can I make someone, get excited about it? So now I've got a couple of questions that I will answer now. From Lisa, how often would you recommend submitting media releases to journalists or pitches? How often would you recommend sending a pitch without being over the top? Look, I think, if you've got stuff to say, I don't know where you're working, but, if you're working with a big organisation that's got a lot of stuff happening, you might be sending out stuff a couple of times a week. But if it's a small organisation that's not doing a lot, then it's probably less regular than that. Probably daily is over the top. You're not a politician. So I think you need to, I think fundamentally it boils down to, do you have stories to give them? How often do you have stories to give them that they might run? And don't delude yourself. Is there stories there that, you could imagine seeing in print, or is it just you thinking that they could make stories? So you've just got to think, I think, in that, through that prism. So how do you then go about it? Well, I think you need to develop several versions of the story for different audiences. You need to develop a compelling story. Doesn't mean just if you've got a compelling story, it doesn't mean that it's one size fits all, because it doesn't. You've got a different target audience for different bits. You've got the same essential story, but how can you sort of repackage it or express it a little bit differently? It's just that will sort of fit in. There might be one element of the story that you can emphasise with the specialist media, the general media gets something else, the women's media gets something else, the Indigenous media gets something. You know how it goes, and think about that rather than sending the same media release out to every single person. I think that's much better as an approach. So you have several versions, might be just several pitches, and don't forget about the lesser known outlets that are geared towards your specific audience, because quite often they are the ones that have got the space and the time and the capacity to follow your story. So, and that will then help you generate some, runs on the board that some of the other outlets will then pick up on, which I think is, important. So, which publications do you need to consider? Make a list of them all, include them all, magazines, news sites, blogs, everywhere. Write them all down and make sure that you've got them all covered. Use AAP if you have got access to that. Highlight various relevant angles that you could use to pitch to journalists. I think is important. We've had a few questions, which is great. So if anyone's got any others, just pop them in the box and we'll just get to them as we go. So building a pitch toolkit, we're going to cover off just for the last part of this discussion today. How do you do that? Well, the next thing you need to focus on is actually developing the materials that you need to do a successful pitch. That includes a list of the media that you want to pitch to, the journalist's contact information, because, you can have a list, but you need to know where they are. And of course, your media kit, what's going to be in that. And so we'll have a think about what that might look like. It's important to plan, but it's more important to have a realistic expectation. Note that your pitches will take a lot of time, to develop. So it's important to start early. You need to start connecting with the journalists way ahead of time. And if you're, before you pitch your material to them, have a look. If they're sitting there on Twitter and they're tweeting away, then you know that they're sitting there and they're a captive audience. So perhaps send them a message on Twitter. Hi, how you going? Blah, blah, blah. And that's perhaps, it's 140 characters and it's a highly efficient pitch that might just work. So set reasonable expectations for yourself along with time frame expectations, and it's important to set reasonable expectations for the success so that the board doesn't think you're going to get front page stories if you're not necessarily going to get them. You need to be realistic so that they know what's going to be, the likely outcome of the coverage. Make a list of the media that will be the best fit for your organisation. So categorise your outlets, choose your targets based on the audiences that you want to reach. That goes without saying in many respects. So choose, a broad audience if you're looking for time in a spotlight, but then, and also recognition for a particular thing, and choose a niche audience or niche outlets if you're hoping for, high quality coverage, high quality leads to reach out to your target demographic. To get started, create a list of media that you believe will be the best fit to cover. Start with them first and work through so that the ones that are least likely to cover probably are at the end of the calling list, if so that the time you use is much more productive at the front end of that pitching time. So when it comes to your media list, less is more. You'll often, if you subscribe to AAP, you can pitch to 20,000 journalists at a press of a button. What you'll probably do by that, if you do that, is you'll alienate people, you'll annoy them. So it is about getting a list that is appropriate and is targeted. And once you've compiled that list of the people that you want to target, have a look at what else they're doing. What are they saying on LinkedIn? What are they saying on Twitter? What have they said in their own outlet? Include a healthy mix of mainstream media, especially specialist publications, because more often than not, that's where you'll get a lot of coverage and quite a bit of interest. But also local media, and ensure that you've got a broad range of people that you might reach out to. So how are you going to build your media kit? Well, when you're finished compiling the list, your press kit will include all the background information on your organisation, the details of the event that you're doing, little known facts about what you do. This might be something that you send as a response to a pitch. So someone says, do you have some more information? This is what you've got to give them. So you don't just give them that in the first instance. This is the follow-up. And this is when they actually want to get something on you. You give them this or elements of this. The team and the founder information, some photos if that's relevant, videos, all in one sort of handy. It could be it might be located, on the back end of your website. It might be in a Dropbox. It just might be some links in an email, but it's in response to them asking you for some information. And very often people now are using photos that people are providing, even if that's mainstream media. So always have some high quality photos, high resolution photos that you can send them, but also high quality, not just ones that, I always recommend people to get photos done professionally, because I think it will reap dividends for you ultimately. You can include your logo if that's something that a specialist publication might run or might include, and include proof of concept. So what are the stats that are relevant to what you're saying or your argument? What are some of the success stories, case studies that you can provide? They're all excellent assets for your media kit. So they're key pieces of information, and they'll give journalists a really handy reference point. If you can package all that up and then get a run, then you're doing very, very well. So what's the next thing you do? You need to create a kit that is going to diversify your media coverage options. So you need to have assets that allow you for a couple of options. So, it might be that it allows for more than just an exclusive story. It might provide, a number of angles. You may not give all of those angles to one person. You might sort of carve it up depending on who it is you're targeting. So, if you give an exclusive to someone, there's only, room for one publication to get that story. So, it is probably a good idea to diversify your options and your coverage possibilities by having a number of looks at the story and a number of angles before you start that pitching process. Media isn't always print. There's so many different forums and platforms. It could be, Instagram, it could be, video, podcasts, radio. Think about everything that is possible to get coverage and go for it, really. And don't exclude anything before you start. So that's the end of the webinar today. I think no one else has got any questions at this stage, and thanks, Lisa, for your questions. If anyone else has got a question, please pop that in now, but otherwise we will wrap it up today. Thank you so much for your time. I'm very grateful to have you joining us, and we do these fairly regularly. We try to do them once a month, and I think the next one will be about blogging. So keep a lookout for that. If you've been on this one today, we'll probably send you an invitation or a reminder that one's on if you wanted to join us. But again, thank you very much, and delighted to have you joining us here today. Have a great rest of the afternoon, and have a good break for those of you that are doing something this Easter. Please enjoy it. Thanks so much.